Welcome to Mystara for a deep dive in ancient history. This week we are looking at the Kingdom of Nithia, which vanished entirely from the planet without a single person remembering who they even were, except for a few in the Hollow World, and some mad monks in Irendi. It represented the largest empire in Mystaran history, stretching from the arm of the Immortals to the Isle of Dawn at least. Now, nothing of Nithia remains aside from mysterious buildings that no one remembers even constructing. At their height, they dominated the planet, even finding the ruins of Blackmoor. Now, they're not even a memory. I'm Mr. Welch, and it's time to walk like an Egyptian. After Blackmoor exploded, everybody was too busy trying to survive the literal fallout to worry about nation building. Nithia was the first human empire to emerge after the Great Rain of Fire, starting their empire where Yalarum now sits. Nithia was nothing like the kingdom of sand that people know and tolerate today. Instead, it was a verdant and fertile land with the great river Nithia supplying water to the kingdom in abundance. It possessed magic on par with Alphatia, and it conquered more lands than the greatest Thaetian emperors could dream of. But the land was also doomed, as the Nithians were notorious for their destructive politics. Constant challenges to the pharaohs led the last ruler turning to entropy to prevent his defeat. The Nithian Empire came to power somewhere around 1500 BC, centered around the Nithian River Delta. The empire started small, just various tribes joining together to share in the bounty the river provided. Eventually, the capital of Nithia rose up at the edge of the delta, surrounded by numerous other cities. The Nithians flourished, and they became the most powerful military as well as magic users on the planet. Once Nithia reached its full strength, it began to expand. The nation conquered in all directions, reaching other continents as well. Buildings of Nithian origin have been found in Scothar, the Savage Coast, Irendi, the Isle of Dawn, possibly as far south as Devania. Nithia's magic made it unstoppable in combat. While their armies lacked armor, they also mass-produced magic amulets that worked as armor for a large portion of their troops. Wizards scoured the battlefield with spells. Their floating pyramids served as mobile strongholds that dominated war zones. Compared to the Bronze Age civilizations around them, Nithia might as well have been the modern U.S. military. Nothing was even going to slow them down. Nithia also used sorcery to create new forms of life to aid them in their conquest. The gnolls were created through gnomes and trolls. Since merging these two races to create mad hyena men is a little silly, I prefer to think that the enslaved gnomish wizards created the race using troll blood or tissue on hyenas, which does make a little bit more sense. Nithians also created the Thuls to serve as shock troops and officers for their humanoid slaves. If you want to explain where weird creatures like the Beholder or Saberclaws came from, blame the Nithians. They loved splicing animals together to create a new one, especially if it was designed for slaughter. The gnolls were their standout creation because they were born to follow orders from their masters. One of the reasons suspected for their tendency for insanity is without masters, they lash out at anyone nearby. The Nithians were highly religious, worshipping their versions of Ixion, Valerius, and Cagiar, as well as giving rise to Thanatos or Anavorus. They spread their religion across their empire, enforcing the will of the Immortals with each conquest. They had a habit of adopting religions as they went, though this was often their Immortals peacefully assimilating cultures that followed another aspect of the Nithians' religion. When the Nithians conquered a region that worshipped other forms of Ixion instead of his Horon aspect, they would embrace the Nithian religion at the encouraging of Ixion. This also increased the spread of the Nithian Empire, as their Immortals embraced the empire that could spread their worship without fail. For those conquered by the Nithians, life was cruel. Nithians used slavery extensively. Anyone who resisted was brutally forced to work on Nithian projects. Even those that surrendered without a fight would often find themselves demoted to serfs, forced to work the fields with little pay or hope of a better life. The Nithians stripped conquered areas of anything of value, sending it back to the capital for the pleasure of the pharaoh and his court. This system of greed and plundering would come back to haunt them. The first signs of trouble for the empire started in 800 BC with the rise of Alfheim. The elves used powerful magic to facilitate the creation of the Canalbarth forest, magic that would divert rain from the green fields of Nithia into the new elven homeland. This process took decades, but eventually the reduction in rainfall caused the Nithians to send a powerful necromancer leading an expedition to find out what was disrupting their rains. The expedition was destroyed in a landslide caused by elven magics, and the necromancer avoided destruction by becoming a lich. The secret of the weather alteration was never discovered by Nithia. Further adding to their destruction was an earthquake in Rockholm, which caused the sources of the river Nithia to divert underground, taking away the nation's primary source of water. Cities died along the dry riverbed as their reason for existing went away. The Empire tried everything in its power to restore the water, but the river no longer existed. They couldn't redirect another river to replace it. There wasn't a source of water large enough to satisfy their needs. The Nithians turned to elemental creatures to solve the problem. But that exacerbated the situation because the elementals of fire and water warred with each other and actually made the problem worse. The spread of the desert across Nithia accelerated. With the problems at the capital redirecting resources and attention from the colonies, revolts and uprisings began to brew. The Nithians on the Savage Coast created the Legacy and started using Cinebril and Red Steel to create an army capable of holding off the Empire's troops, long enough for those nobles to start their own empire. Slaves revolted across Nithia, tired of the terrible conditions that were being forced upon them. The beleaguered empire was stretched even further as much-needed food from their colonies stopped arriving, while colonial governors tried to put down the increasing number of slave revolts. Nithia was tearing itself apart at the seams. Taphos, the last Nithian pharaoh, turned to the entropic Immortals to save his empire. One of them, Thanatos, actually was Nithian in his mortal days. He agreed to help preserve the Nithian empire if Taphos would follow him in his teachings. Taphos began planning a ceremony that would turn everyone in the empire into undead, thus preserving Nithia for all time. Horrified, the Immortals of the other spheres came together to stop this plan. Their tactic was effective, but harsh. They created the Spell of Oblivion. The Immortals locked away the entire Nithian empire in another plane of existence. The Nithian population vanished, aside from a single colony on Nithia on the Isle of Dawn, the only colony to reject the mad plan of their pharaoh. To make sure that no one would ever try to follow in Nithia's footsteps, the Immortals wiped the very memory of Nithia from the mind of every creature in Mystara. The empire wasn't only gone, it was utterly forgotten. The Nithians woke up one day believing they were the original settlers of their lands, with no actual knowledge of their past. The pyramids across the globe that were built by the Nithians to other cultures appeared to have been built overnight the next day. Not all of Nithia was lost. Some of the Nithians were preserved in the Hollow World, specifically the city of Rannoch, which rebelled openly against the Emperor Taphos. On Irindi, a group of Nithians was allowed to remain, linking the exiled Nithian Empire to the known world, but only remembered by a group of apparently insane monks, who are actually forbidden by immortal magic to tell anyone of their origin. Because of this, their language is scrambled by the Immortals. No amount of magic can translate the words they're saying. Anyone who visits them on White Island in Irindi risks being cursed as well, joining the monks for all time and having their speech garbled. Across the globe, people were rediscovering Nithian pyramids and buildings with no idea who built them, despite them being there for centuries. In the blink of an eye, a 1,000-year-old empire was completely erased, along with any writings that mentioned them, as well as their magic items and artifacts. Only empty pyramids and similar monuments remained. The various colonies began to believe that they were the source of these buildings, or at least their ancestors were, even when the style or creation of the building was alien or impossible for that culture to replicate. The gnolls that were used as frontline fighters for the Nithians suddenly had no memory of their origin. Their officers were gone. Their very reason for existing was lost. The now leaderless creatures rampaged across the known world, destroying everything they encountered. Their invasion of the kingdom of Traladara led to the rise of Halav and the unification of the Traldar people. Gnolls were created to follow orders, specifically someone else's orders, so they flocked to the banner of any creature strong enough to lead them. The immortal Ranavoris appeared as the savior of the Gnolls, and they followed his orders without question, though his influence did nothing to appease their bouts of insanity. Garrel Glitterlode appeared before a tribe of Gnolls in another guise to try to save some of the creations of the gnomes. He helped this tribe deal with their insanity, giving them a sense of purpose and an outlet for their violent tendencies. These gnolls turned away from entropy, though they weren't exactly good either, and eventually they helped form the nation of Gracalia. The Empire's creation of legacies compounds the three-part curse on the Savage Coast. The magical alterations affect most of the people in the Savage Baronies, and quite a few outside of it. The very concept of the legacies were created by Nithian wizards, though twisted into curses by the interference of others. The erasure of Nithia makes lifting the red curse almost impossible. With no actual memory of the cause of the legacies, the people looking for relief don't even know the real source of it. Only the Nithians of the Hollow World possess the knowledge of the original Nithian magic, but they are unaware of the Savage Coast, and the surface world doesn't know they exist. The Nithian Empire is long dead, but their legacy still haunts Mystara across the globe. Lost Nithian structures hide unspeakable horrors, and nations from Alphatia to the arm of the Immortals. The creatures they brought into existence to serve as slaves and warriors were unleashed on the world without anything to control them. Undead created during the dying days of the Empire still roam the sands of Yalarum. To add to this, an artifact buried in Yalarum called the Bead of Oblivion wipes the memory of Nithia of anyone who approaches the city of Sura Manra. To find the ancient artifacts of Nithia, you have to go to the region where the very memory of Nithia is erased the moment you arrive. Nithia as an adventure hook is both easy and difficult. If you want unusual adventures, there's nothing better than traveling to the far north among the tundra and finding an Egyptian-style pyramid in the middle of the permafrost. Anytime you need something mysterious for the party to discover, Nithia is a go-to source. If they want to actually learn anything about Nithia, they have to discover the Nithian outposts that still survive, mostly in the Hollow World. Thothia might look like old Nithia, but nobody remembers it. As far as they know, it's always been Thothia. Next up, I'm going to talk about a subject that I've been asked to cover for a while, Thunder Rift. This is actually a series of modules that have needed to be talked about, and I've just acquired them, so I'm going to start with the titular Thunder Rift. These were made canon in Mystara, though the board games are a little bit outside the scope of a review. So for the next several weeks, I'm talking about some of the least known modules in the game. Until then, bricka bracka firecracker, shish boom ba, sun god, rah rah rah.